Marcus Reed was having what he liked to call a perfectly normal Tuesday in space, when everything went sideways. Which, considering he was the only human aboard an alien research vessel called the Stellar Harmony, meant his definition of normal had become pretty flexible over the past 2 years. He was currently elbow-deep in the ship's backup generator, trying to figure out why the Zephyrian engineers had thought it was a good idea to route the plasma conduits through the waste disposal system. The smell alone was enough to make him question every life choice that had led him to this moment. "Marcus!" The voice belonged to Captain Vorthak, a 7-foot-tall, purple, lizard-looking alien who took bureaucratic procedures about as seriously as humans took breathing. "Report to the bridge immediately. We have a situation." Marcus wiped his hands on his coveralls and sighed. In his experience, when aliens said they had a situation, it usually meant someone had pressed the wrong button, and now they were either about to explode or crash into something. Sometimes both. He found the bridge in what could charitably be called controlled chaos. Captain Vorthak was standing at attention, his scales practically vibrating with stress, while Science Officer Chilix hunched over her console making worried clicking sounds. Chilix looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a computer, and she had the social skills to match. Navigator Bleem was in the corner, hyperventilating into what Marcus assumed was the alien equivalent of a paper bag. Bleem resembled a nervous jellyfish that had somehow learned to operate spacecraft, and he approached every minor inconvenience like it was the end of the universe. "Ah, Marcus," Vorthak said, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority that suggested he was about to make someone else's problem into Marcus's problem. "We have experienced what your people might call an emergency landing." Marcus looked out the viewport at the frozen wasteland stretching endlessly in all directions. Ice, snow, more ice, and what appeared to be some very unfriendly-looking crystal formations jutting up from the ground like nature's own security system. "Let me guess," Marcus said. "The engine decided to take an unscheduled vacation." "The primary drive core has suffered a catastrophic failure," Chilix announced without looking up from her screens. "Additionally, long-range sensors indicate an ion storm of unprecedented magnitude approaching this system. Estimated arrival 6 hours, duration approximately 3 months. Bleem made a sound like a deflating balloon. "We're all going to die. I knew I should have stayed in accounting." "Nobody panic," Marcus said, which was pretty much guaranteed to make everyone panic more. "I take it we're setting up a temporary base while we wait for rescue?" "Precisely," Vorthak said, puffing out his chest. "I have already transmitted our distress signal. However, given the incoming ion storm, it will likely be some time before rescue arrives. We must establish a survival shelter immediately." The next few hours passed in a blur of organized chaos. The crew worked with the desperate efficiency of people who really didn't want to become alien popsicles. They managed to set up a basic shelter using the ship's emergency habitat modules, complete with life support, food processors, and what passed for creature comforts in alien society. Marcus, being the ship's fix-it guy, was naturally assigned to the most crucial and dangerous job, getting the backup generator online in the remote auxiliary station about half a mile from the main base, because of course he was. "This should only take a few hours," he called out to the others as he trudged through the snow toward the auxiliary station. "Don't leave without me." He meant it as a joke. In hindsight, maybe he should have been more specific. The backup generator was located in what could generously be called a glorified shed, but at least it was heated. Marcus settled in for what he expected to be a routine repair job, listening to the wind howling outside and the occasional status update crackling through his comm unit. "Generator, repair, proceeding on schedule," he reported after 2 hours of wrestling with alien engineering that seemed designed by someone who had never heard of the concept of user-friendly. "Acknowledged," came Vorthak's voice. "Continue your work. The ion storm approaches rapidly." Marcus was just connecting the final power coupling when he heard it, the distinctive whine of ship engines spinning up. He paused, wrench in hand, and listened more carefully. "Hey guys," he said into his comm. "Please tell me you're not warming up the engines because you found a quick fix for the drive core." Silence. West. More silence. Marcus dropped his tools and ran outside, just in time to see the Stellar Harmony disappearing into the storm-darkened sky, leaving nothing but engine wash and the kind of profound silence that usually preceded very bad news. He stood there for a long moment, watching the ship's lights fade into the distance, while snow began to fall more heavily around him. "Well," he said to the empty, frozen landscape, "this is either going to be really boring or really interesting." The wind picked up, and Marcus pulled his jacket tighter around himself as he walked back toward the main base. He had a feeling it was going to be both. Marcus walked back to the main base through increasingly heavy snow, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The ion storm was really picking up now, and the air had that electric feeling that made his teeth ache. He pulled open the heavy door to the habitat module and stepped inside, shaking snow off his jacket. "Hello?" he called out, even though he already knew the answer. "Anyone forget to pack their human?" The silence was deafening. Well, almost deafening. There was the hum of life support systems, the occasional beep from monitoring equipment, and what sounded like the heater working overtime to keep the place from turning into a meat locker. Marcus took a deep breath and assessed his situation with the kind of methodical thinking that had kept him alive through 2 years of alien engineering disasters. First, the good news: he wasn't dead yet. Second, the less good news: he was stranded on a frozen planet with a 3-month ion storm bearing down on him, and his only companions were whatever supplies the crew had managed to set up before their hasty departure. He started with the basics. Food first. The emergency rations were stored in what the aliens called a nutrition dispensary, and what Marcus called the machine that turns perfectly good ingredients into disappointment. He pressed a few buttons and watched as it produced something that looked like gray paste and smelled like wet cardboard. He said, taking a tentative bite. "It's like they took everything good about food and scientifically removed it." The taste was exactly what he expected. Imagine if someone had tried to recreate the concept of nutrition using only their vague memories of having eaten something once. But it would keep him alive, and according to the display, there was enough for maybe 2 weeks, if he was careful. Marcus moved on to the communications array, which was flashing more warning lights than a Christmas tree having an electrical malfunction. He popped open the control panel and immediately saw the problem. The primary transmitter had been damaged during landing. Without it, he had no way to contact the outside universe or let anyone know he was still breathing. "Of course," he muttered, examining the fried circuitry, "because why would anything be easy?" The good news was that it was fixable. The bad news was that it would take time, and he'd need to cannibalize parts from other systems to do it. The worst news was that even if he fixed it, the ion storm would probably fry it again the moment he turned it on. But Marcus had learned something important during his time with aliens. They were really, really good at overcomplicating simple problems. Their technology was impressive, sure, but it was designed by people who thought the best way to open a door was to solve a mathematical equation while standing on one foot. Human engineering, on the other hand, was built around a simple principle: if it's stupid and it works, it's not stupid. Marcus spent the next few hours taking inventory of everything available. The aliens had left behind basic tools, spare parts for various systems, and what appeared to be enough raw materials to build a small city if you were creative enough. They'd also left behind their standard operating procedures manual, which was about as useful as a chocolate teapot but made excellent kindling. By the time the ion storm really hit, Marcus had already started making improvements. He jury-rigged the food processor to actually add flavor to the rations by routing some of the chemical sensors through the heating elements. It was probably not what the manufacturers had intended, but it meant his dinner tasted like something approaching actual food instead of despair. He'd also figured out how to boost the heating system by redirecting power from non-essential systems. The aliens had apparently considered things like entertainment and comfort to be essential, while Marcus was more interested in not freezing to death. Outside, the storm was now howling with the fury of 1,000 angry gods. The wind was strong enough to rattle the habitat module's reinforced walls, and through the small window Marcus could see nothing but swirling snow and the occasional flash of lightning that made the whole landscape look like the surface of an angry planet. "Well," Marcus said to the empty room, settling into what looked like the most comfortable chair the aliens had managed to pack, "this is either going to be the most boring 3 months of my life, or I'm going to learn just how creative humans can get when they're properly motivated." He looked around at the basic shelter, already mentally cataloging a dozen ways he could improve it. The aliens had built a survival shelter, but Marcus was thinking bigger. Much bigger. He pulled out his toolkit and started sketching modifications on the back of the operations manual. After all, he had 3 months to kill, and if there was one thing humans were good at, it was turning impossible situations into opportunities for improvement. "Time to show these aliens what human ingenuity looks like," he said, and got to work. 3 months, as it turned out, was plenty of time for a motivated human to completely redesign an alien survival shelter. Marcus had discovered that boredom was an incredibly powerful motivator, especially when combined with a decent toolkit and the kind of stubborn determination that had gotten humanity to the stars in the first place. Week 1 had been about survival. Week 2 had been about comfort. By week 3, Marcus had moved on to what he liked to call aggressive home improvement, and by month 2, he was operating on a level that would have made those home renovation shows back on Earth look like amateur hour. The Habitat module now bore about as much resemblance to its original design as a race car bore to a shopping cart. Sure, they both had wheels, but that's where the similarities ended. Marcus had started with the heating system, because nobody thinks clearly when they're cold. The aliens had installed a basic thermal unit that kept the temperature at what they considered survivable. Marcus had other ideas. He'd tapped into the geothermal vents he'd discovered about 50 meters from the base, routing heated water through a network of pipes he'd fashioned from spare hull plating. Now the place was warm enough that he could walk around in a t-shirt, which was a significant improvement over slowly freezing to death. The food situation had required more creativity. The alien rations were nutritionally complete, but had all the flavor of recycled cardboard. Marcus had solved this by basically rebuilding the food processor from scratch, adding what he generously called flavor enhancement protocols that involved a complex series of chemical reactions he'd figured out through trial and error. The result was food that actually tasted like food instead of like someone's vague memory of having eaten something once. But the real breakthrough had come when he'd started exploring the local ecosystem. The planet wasn't as dead as it had first appeared. There were these crystalline creatures that emerged from the ice caves during the calmer periods between storm fronts. They looked like someone had crossed a house cat with a disco ball, and they were apparently curious about the strange, warm-blooded alien who'd taken up residence in their territory. Marcus had started calling them sparkles because they literally sparkled when they moved, and because giving them a cute name made him feel less like he was slowly going insane from isolation. The sparkles, as it turned out, were not only harmless, but actually quite intelligent. They'd started bringing him things. Interesting rocks, pieces of ice with unusual formations, and what appeared to be some kind of local plant life that grew in the thermal vents. "You know what, Sparkles?" Marcus said to the largest of the creatures, which had taken to following him around like a glittery pet. "I think you're trying to help me set up a garden." And that's exactly what they were doing. The plant life, when properly cultivated, turned out to be not only edible but actually quite nutritious. Marcus had converted one of the unused sections of the habitat into a hydroponic garden, using the thermal vent water as a heat source and the Sparkles plant donations as starter crops. By month 2, he was growing his own vegetables. By month 3, he was eating better than he had during his entire time aboard the Stellar Harmony. The workshop had been another major project. The aliens had packed basic tools, apparently under the assumption that basic meant barely functional. Marcus had other ideas. He'd cannibalized parts from non-essential systems to build a proper machine shop, complete with fabrication equipment that could produce just about anything he needed. This had led to what Marcus considered his masterpiece, the entertainment system. The aliens had apparently never heard of the concept of recreation, but Marcus had spent years listening to their complaints about boredom during long space flights. He'd built a multimedia center that could play Earth music, display movies, and even generate simple video games. The power source was a combination of the geothermal system and what he'd started calling his creative electrical engineering. The communications array had been fixed within the first month, but Marcus had kept that little detail to himself. He'd been intercepting the crew's increasingly guilt-ridden transmissions for weeks, and honestly, the entertainment value was better than anything his multimedia system could produce. "Day 47 of our return journey," came Captain Vorthak's voice through the speakers. "I have reviewed the abandonment protocols 17 times. There was no provision for counting crew members before departure. This is a significant oversight in our procedures. The probability of human survival in those conditions was approximately 0.003%, Keelix added, her voice heavy with what Marcus assumed was alien guilt. "I have run the calculations numerous times. The results remain consistent." Liam's voice came through as barely a whisper. "We killed him. We killed Marcus. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I keep seeing his face when I close my eyes." Marcus looked around at his improved habitat, then at the Sparkles, who were lounging in the warm spots near the heating vents, then at the thriving garden that was producing fresh vegetables for dinner. "Sorry, guys," he said to the communication array, "but I'm having way too much fun to ruin the surprise." He'd also improved the base's external defenses, not because there were any threats, but because he'd gotten bored and decided to see if he could build a weather shield. The result was an energy barrier that deflected the worst of the storm winds and provided a clear area around the base where he could work on outside projects. The most recent addition was what he called the relaxation deck, a covered area with comfortable seating where he could sit with his Sparkles friends and watch the aurora-like light shows that the ion storm created in the upper atmosphere. It was actually quite beautiful, once you weren't worried about dying from exposure. Marcus had kept a daily log of his improvements, partly for documentation and partly because talking to himself had helped maintain his sanity. As he reviewed his notes, he realized he'd basically turned a basic survival shelter into something that was more comfortable than most human space stations. "You know what, Sparkles?" he said to his crystalline companions, who were arranged around him like glittery house cats. "I think I'm going to miss this place when they come back." Outside, the storm was finally beginning to weaken. According to his calculations, the crew should be returning within the next few days. Marcus looked around at his handiwork and smiled. He had a feeling the reunion was going to be interesting. Meanwhile, aboard the rescue vessel Compassionate Endeavor, the crew of the Stellar Harmony was experiencing what humans might call a collective nervous breakdown, though they were handling it with the kind of rigid bureaucratic formality that only made everything worse. Captain Vorthak stood in his temporary quarters, staring at a personnel file that might as well have been a death certificate. Marcus Reed, human, age 34, position, maintenance engineer. Status, abandoned on hostile world, presumed deceased. The words blurred together as he read them for the 100th time that day. "Computer, begin personal log, stardate 77-42-3, he said, his voice carrying the weight of command authority that was starting to crack around the edges. "It has been 73 days since the evacuation of Kythara 7. I have reviewed the emergency protocols extensively, and while our actions were technically within acceptable parameters, the result remains unacceptable." He paused, his scales shifting color in a way that indicated extreme stress. The human Marcus Reed was not included in the final head count. "This represents a catastrophic failure in our standard operating procedures. I have submitted a formal recommendation for protocol revision to prevent similar incidents in the future." What he didn't say in his official log was that he'd been waking up in cold sweats every night, imagining Marcus's final moments on that frozen wasteland. The human had been the most reliable member of his crew, the one who could fix anything, solve any problem, and do it all with that strange human combination of competence and irreverence that Vortak had never quite understood, but had come to depend on. Down in the science lab, Kilex was having her own crisis of logic. She'd run the survival calculations so many times that she'd started questioning the fundamental principles of mathematics. The numbers were clear. No sentient being could survive 3 months on Kythara 7 with the limited supplies available. The temperature alone would have killed most species within days. "Computer, run survival simulation 847, she said, her mandibles clicking with anxiety. "Parameters: 1 human male, standard emergency supplies, 3-month duration, ambient temperature -40 degrees Celsius. The computer's response was always the same. Probability of survival, 0.003%. Margin of error, negligible. "That's what I thought," Calyx muttered. But she ran the simulation anyway. She'd been doing this for weeks, changing variables, adjusting parameters, trying to find some combination of circumstances that would give Marcus even a slim chance of survival. The math was relentless in its pessimism. But humans, she'd learned, had a disturbing tendency to ignore mathematics when it didn't suit them. Marcus had once fixed a plasma conduit by bypassing 3 safety systems and using what he'd called percussive maintenance, which apparently meant hitting things with a wrench until they worked. The technique had been completely at odds with established engineering principles, but it had worked perfectly. "Maybe," she said to herself, "the calculations don't account for human stubbornness." Navigator Bleem was having the worst time of all. While Vortak dealt with guilt through bureaucracy and Kilex through obsessive calculation, Bleem was simply falling apart. He'd moved his workstation to the ship's chapel, where he spent most of his time composing increasingly elaborate apologies to Marcus's memory. "Dear Marcus," he dictated to his personal log, "I know you cannot hear this, but I need to tell you that your death was not in vain. Your sacrifice has taught us the importance of proper headcount procedures. New regulations have been implemented. Color-coded badges will be distributed. A buddy system has been established." He paused, his translucent form quivering with emotion. "I have also taken the liberty of composing a ceremonial song in your honor. It is called The Ballad of the Abandoned Human, and it will be performed at the memorial service we are planning for your homeworld." The song was actually quite good, in a depressing alien way, but Marcus would have probably laughed himself silly if he'd heard it. It involved a lot of harmonious wailing about the tragic fate of the noble human who fixed things with his clever hands and died alone in the cold dark of space. The worst part was that they'd tried to return earlier, multiple times in fact. The first attempt had been blocked by the Galactic Safety Commission, which had deemed the ion storm too dangerous for rescue operations. The second attempt had been delayed by a fuel shortage at the nearest station. The third attempt had been postponed when their original rescue ship had suffered a mechanical failure that, ironically, would have been easily fixable if Marcus had been there. The bureaucracy is killing him as surely as the cold, Vorthak had said during one of their planning meetings, which was probably the most emotional outburst anyone had ever seen from him. By the time they'd finally gotten clearance for the rescue mission, assembled a proper crew, and made the journey back to Kythara 7, they were all convinced they were going to find a corpse. The plan was simple: land at the base, recover Marcus's body, give him a proper burial, and try to live with the guilt for the rest of their lives. They'd even prepared a memorial service. Bleem had written a speech about human resilience and the bonds of friendship that transcended species. Kylix had compiled a technical analysis of Marcus's contributions to their research mission. Vorthak had prepared a formal commendation for Marcus's personnel file, along with a recommendation for posthumous promotion to chief engineer. "Approaching Kythara 7, came the pilot's voice over the intercom. "Ion storm has dissipated. Weather conditions are stable. Preparing for landing at the emergency base coordinates." The three of them stood on the bridge, watching the frozen planet grow larger in the viewport. It looked exactly as hostile and uninviting as they remembered. The base coordinates showed up on the scanner as a small cluster of structures, surrounded by endless ice and snow. "Scanning for life signs," Kylix announced, her voice carefully neutral. They all knew what the scanners would show. "Multiple life signs detected," the computer announced. "Species unknown. Biosignatures consistent with local fauna. No human readings?" Vorthak asked, though he already knew the answer. "Negative. No human biosignatures detected in the immediate area." Bleem made a sound like a deflating balloon. "He's gone. We're too late." "We will recover his remains," Vorthak said firmly. "And we will honor his memory. It is the least we can do." As they prepared for landing, none of them noticed the energy readings from the base that were significantly higher than what the emergency shelter should have been producing. None of them spotted the external modifications that were clearly visible from orbit. And none of them detected the communication signals that had been monitoring their approach for the past 6 hours. If they had been paying attention, they might have noticed that someone was about to give them the surprise of their lives. The landing was textbook perfect, which was ironic considering that everything else about this mission had been a disaster from start to finish. The compassionate Endeavour touched down about 100 meters from the emergency base, its engines kicking up clouds of snow and ice that swirled around the landing site like a frozen tornado. Captain Vorthak stood at the airlock, wearing what he probably thought was a dignified expression, but actually looked more like someone preparing for a root canal. Behind him, Kylix clutched her scanner like a security blanket, while Bleem had gone so pale he was practically transparent. "Remember," Vorthak said, his voice carrying the weight of command authority mixed with barely contained grief. "We are here to honor our fallen comrade. We will conduct ourselves with the dignity befitting his sacrifice." "The temperature is -37 degrees Celsius, Kylix reported, her mandibles clicking with nervous energy. "Atmospheric pressure is stable, no immediate hazards detected." "Except for the hazard of finding our friend's frozen corpse," Bleem whispered, which didn't help anyone's mood. The airlock cycled open, and they stepped out into the cold, crisp air of Kythara 7. The first thing they noticed was that the emergency base looked different. Instead of the basic habitat modules they'd left behind, there was what appeared to be a small complex of interconnected structures, complete with what looked like external modifications that definitely hadn't been in the original design. "That's odd," Kylix said, consulting her scanner. "The base appears to have been significantly modified. Energy readings are much higher than expected." "Perhaps the systems malfunctioned," Vorthak suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Overloaded during the storm." As they approached the main entrance, they could hear something that made them all stop dead in their tracks. Music. Not the harmonious alien melodies they were used to, but something with a distinctly human rhythm and what sounded like actual instruments. "Is that—" Bleem began, then trailed off, apparently unable to finish the thought. The music was coming from inside the base, along with what sounded like the hum of well-demanding machinery and, impossibly, the sound of someone humming along to the melody. Vorthak reached for the door controls with trembling hands. The door slid open to reveal an interior that bore absolutely no resemblance to the basic survival shelter they'd left behind. The walls were painted in warm colors, The lighting was soft and welcoming, and the temperature was comfortable enough that whoever was inside was apparently wandering around in casual clothes. "What in the name of the 7 stars?" Vorthak whispered. That's when Marcus Reed walked around the corner, carrying what appeared to be a steaming mug of something that smelled suspiciously like real coffee. He was wearing a comfortable-looking sweater, his hair was neatly trimmed, and he looked healthier than he had during their entire time together on the Stellar Harmony. "Oh, hey guys," Marcus said as casually as if he was greeting them at a backyard barbecue. "You're right on time. I was just about to start dinner." The 3 aliens stood there in stunned silence, their mouths hanging open in expressions of shock that would have been hilarious if Marcus hadn't been too busy enjoying their reactions to laugh. "You're," Kalex began, then stopped, apparently unable to process what she was seeing. "Alive," Marcus finished helpfully. "Yeah, I get that a lot. Well, I would if I had anyone to talk to besides the Sparkles, but they're not much for conversation." "The Sparkles?" Bleem squeaked. As if on cue, 3 of the crystalline creatures appeared from various corners of the room, moving with the casual confidence of pets who owned the place. They sparkled cheerfully in the warm light, and one of them made a sound that was almost like purring. "Local wildlife," Marcus explained, scratching behind what might have been ears on the nearest Sparkle. "Turns out they're quite friendly once you get to know them. This one's Disco, that one's Prism, and the big one over there is Glitter. They've been excellent company." Vorthak finally found his voice. "Marcus, we thought you were dead. The calculations indicated that survival was impossible. The temperature, the limited supplies, the duration of the storm." "Yeah, about that," Marcus said, taking a sip of his coffee. "Your calculations were based on the assumption that I'd sit here and wait to die like a good little alien. But here's the thing about humans. We don't really do that." He gestured around the transformed base with obvious pride. "Welcome to Marcus Reed's improved survival facility, now featuring geothermal heating, hydroponic gardens, a fully equipped workshop, and what I like to call the entertainment sector. Oh, and I fixed the communications array about 2 months ago." The silence that followed this statement was so complete that they could hear the gentle hum of the heating system and the soft crackling of what appeared to be a fireplace in the corner. "You fixed the communications array 2 months ago?" Kelex finally managed to ask. "Oh yeah," Marcus said, grinning. "I've been listening to your guilt-ridden transmissions for weeks. Really touching stuff, by the way, especially Bleem's song. The Ballad of the Abandoned Human? Classic. I particularly enjoyed the part about my noble sacrifice and clever hands." Bleem made a sound like a deflating balloon and slowly sat down on what appeared to be a very comfortable chair that definitely hadn't been part of the original furniture. "You've been listening to us?" Vorthak asked, his voice rising to what might have been considered a shout by alien standards. "Entertainment has been limited," Marcus said with a shrug. "Your daily guilt sessions were better than anything I could have programmed into the media system. Although I did enjoy Kelix's increasingly desperate attempts to find a mathematical solution to my survival. Very persistent. I respect that." Kelex looked around at the transformed base, her scientific mind clearly trying to process what she was seeing. "This is impossible. The energy requirements alone should have overwhelmed the basic systems. How did you power all of this?" "Geothermal," Marcus said, leading them on what was clearly a practice tour. "Tapped into the thermal vents about 50 meters from here. Simple engineering, really. You just have to think outside the box." He showed them the hydroponic garden, where fresh vegetables were growing in neat rows under carefully calibrated lighting. The Sparkles actually helped with this part. They knew which local plants were edible and where to find the good soil. Turns out this planet isn't as dead as it looks. The workshop was next, a fully equipped facility that looked like it could manufacture just about anything a person might need. Built this mostly from spare parts you guys left behind. Amazing what you can accomplish when you're not worried about violating manufacturer warranties. The entertainment area featured comfortable seating, a large display screen, and what appeared to be a sound system that was currently playing soft background music. "Had to do something during the long nights. Built this whole multimedia system from scratch. I've been catching up on all the Earth movies I missed." Finally, he showed them the relaxation deck, an enclosed area with large windows that offered a spectacular view of the aurora displays in the upper atmosphere. "This is where I like to have my morning coffee and watch the light show. It's actually quite beautiful, once you're not worried about freezing to death." The 3 aliens followed him through the tour in stunned silence, occasionally making small sounds of amazement or disbelief. By the time they returned to the main living area, they all looked like they'd been hit by a transport shuttle. "The probability of this level of modification was essentially 0, Kelex said almost to herself. "The energy calculations, the resource requirements, the technical complexity." Yeah, well, Marcus said, settling into his favorite chair, with the sparkles arranging themselves around him like glittery cushions. Humans have a funny relationship with probability. We tend to treat it more like a suggestion than a law of physics. Vortak was still staring around the room, his scales shifting through colors that probably indicated extreme confusion. How long did all this take you? About 6 weeks for the basic improvements, Marcus said casually. The rest was just refinements and upgrades. I had plenty of time, and honestly, I was getting bored. Bored, Bleem repeated faintly. Oh, and I should mention, Marcus added, I could have fixed the communications array on day 1, but I was actually enjoying the peace and quiet. Do you have any idea how much you guys complain during a normal workday? This has been like a 3-month vacation. The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the gentle purring of the sparkles and the distant hum of perfectly functioning machinery. So, Marcus said cheerfully, who's ready for dinner? I've got fresh vegetables from the garden, and I finally figured out how to make your food processor produce something that actually tastes like food instead of cardboard. Dinner turned out to be a surprisingly civilized affair, considering that 3 of the participants had spent the last 3 months convinced they were murderers, and the 4th had been secretly enjoying their psychological torment while building himself a winter palace. Marcus had prepared what he called fusion cuisine, which apparently meant taking alien vegetables and cooking them in ways that actually made them taste good. The result was a meal that was not only edible but genuinely delicious, served on plates that Marcus had somehow fabricated in his workshop, and accompanied by what tasted suspiciously like real wine. This is actually quite good, Vortak admitted, though he still looked like he was processing the reality of the situation. How did you manage to improve the taste so dramatically? Simple chemistry, Marcus said, refilling everyone's glasses from a bottle that definitely hadn't been part of the original supplies. Your food processors are designed to preserve nutrition and extend shelf life, but they completely ignore the concept of flavor. I just added a few chemical reactions to the process, nothing fancy. Chilex was examining her meal with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex equation. The nutrient density appears to be significantly higher than standard rations. How is this possible? The hydroponic garden, Marcus explained, gesturing toward the growing area where the sparkles were lounging under the warm growing lights. Fresh vegetables have better nutritional profiles than processed ones. Plus, the local soil turned out to be incredibly rich in minerals. The sparkles showed me where to find the good stuff. The sparkles showed you, Bleem repeated, watching as Disco wandered over to investigate his plate. You're telling us you established communication with an alien species? Not exactly communication, Marcus said, scratching Disco behind what might have been ears. More like mutual cooperation. They're curious about technology, and I'm curious about their planet. We worked out a pretty good trade relationship. They bring me interesting rocks and plants. I let them play with my tools. As if to demonstrate, Prism approached Marcus's chair and deposited what looked like a particularly beautiful crystal formation on the table. Marcus examined it appreciatively, before offering the creature a small piece of vegetable from his plate. Remarkable, Kalex murmured. In 3 months you've accomplished more xenobiological research than most teams manage in years. Well, Marcus said, taking a sip of his wine, I had the advantage of being stranded here with nothing better to do. Plus, they're actually quite helpful once you figure out they're not trying to eat you. The meal continued in relative silence, broken only by the occasional comment about the food, or a question about one of Marcus's modifications. The aliens seemed to be struggling with the fundamental disconnect between their expectations and reality. Finally, Vortak set down his fork and looked directly at Marcus. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Sure, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. Shoot. Could you have contacted us at any point during these 3 months? Marcus considered this for a moment, then nodded. Oh, absolutely. I had the communications array fixed by week 4. I could have called for pickup any time after that. The silence that followed this admission was deafening. But you didn't, Kalex said, her voice carefully neutral. Nope, Marcus confirmed cheerfully. Best 3 months I've had in years. Valine made a sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a laugh. We thought we'd killed you. I haven't slept properly in months. I composed a funeral song. I've been planning your memorial service. I heard, Marcus said. Really touching stuff. I especially liked the part about my tragic sacrifice for the advancement of science. Very dramatic. You've been listening to us having nervous breakdowns, Vortak said, his scales shifting to what Marcus had learned was the alien equivalent of deep embarrassment. And you found it entertaining. Look, Marcus said, spreading his hands. I'm not proud of it, but yes, Do you have any idea how much you three complain during a normal workday? Vorthak, you spend half your time griping about bureaucratic procedures. Culex, you're constantly muttering about how nobody appreciates proper scientific methodology. And Bleem, you worry about everything. Literally everything. He gestured around the transformed base. This has been like a 3-month vacation from all of that. No status reports, no emergency repairs, no listening to arguments about optimal route calculations, just me, my projects, and the occasional visit from my sparkly friends here. The three aliens exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared realization that they had been, in effect, played by their human colleague. So what happens now? Elex asked. Do we just go back to the way things were? Marcus leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. Well, that depends. I've learned some things about myself during these 3 months. Turns out I'm actually pretty good at this whole independent problem-solving thing when I don't have to work around alien bureaucracy and safety protocols. He stood up and walked over to a wall display that showed detailed schematics of his various modifications. I've documented everything I've done here. The geothermal power system, the hydroponic gardens, the manufacturing setup, the communications improvements, even the entertainment system. Any one of these innovations could revolutionize how we approach long-term space missions. Vortak studied the displays with growing amazement. This is incredibly advanced work. The applications for deep space exploration could be enormous. Exactly, Marcus said. But here's the thing. I did all of this in 3 months, working alone, with basic tools and spare parts. Imagine what I could accomplish with proper resources and a crew that actually trusts my judgment. He turned back to face them, and for the first time since they'd arrived, his expression was completely serious. I want a promotion, chief engineer, with full authority over technical decisions. No more having to explain every modification to a committee. No more safety protocols that assume I'm an idiot, and definitely no more food that tastes like cardboard. The three aliens looked at each other, then back at Marcus, then at the transformed base around them. Done, Vorthak said without hesitation. Chief Engineer Reed, whatever you need. Also, Marcus added, I'm keeping the Sparkles. They're excellent assistants, and they've earned their place on the crew. As if understanding they were being discussed, the three crystalline creatures arranged themselves around Marcus's chair and began emitting soft, harmonious tones that sounded almost like purring. I'm not sure the bureaucracy will approve of non-standard crew members, Vorthak said uncertainly. Marcus smiled, and there was something in that smile that suggested he'd been thinking about this for a while. Captain, I just spent 3 months turning a basic survival shelter into a technological marvel, using nothing but spare parts and human stubbornness. I'm pretty sure I can handle some paperwork. Felix was still studying the technical displays. The efficiency improvements alone would justify any bureaucratic complications. This work represents a quantum leap in our understanding of sustainable life support systems. And think about it, Marcus continued, settling back into his chair with the Sparkles arranging themselves around him like glittery cushions. Next time you accidentally abandon me somewhere, I might actually be disappointed instead of relieved. Bleem made a sound that was definitely a laugh this time. There won't be a next time. I've already implemented 17 new safety protocols to prevent crew abandonment. 17? Marcus raised an eyebrow. That seems like overkill, even for you. I may have been somewhat traumatized by the experience, Bleem admitted. Color-coded badges, buddy systems, electronic head counts, backup head counts for the backup head counts. Right, Marcus said, grinning. Well, in that case, I guess we won't have to worry about me getting another 3-month vacation anytime soon. He raised his glass of wine in a toast. To the crew of the Stellar Harmony, may we never again confuse abandonment with opportunity. The three aliens raised their glasses, still looking slightly stunned but beginning to smile. To Chief Engineer Reed, Vorthak said formally, and to the most expensive vacation in galactic history. To human ingenuity, Culex added, and to the day we stopped underestimating our maintenance engineer. To never having to sing that funeral song, Bleem contributed, which made everyone laugh. As they drank their toast, Marcus looked around at his transformed base one more time. Tomorrow they'd pack up his improvements, load the Sparkles onto the ship, and return to their normal routine of space exploration and alien bureaucracy. But something had changed during these 3 months. They'd learned something important about human adaptability, about the difference between surviving and thriving, and about the value of trusting people to exceed expectation. You know what the funny thing is, Marcus said, scratching glitter behind the ears. I actually missed you guys. Not enough to call for help, obviously, but enough to look forward to showing off when you got back. We missed you too, Vortak said, and for once his voice carried genuine warmth instead of bureaucratic formality. More than we realized. Although, Kilex added, next time you decide to take an extended sabbatical, perhaps you could mention it in advance? My calculations would have been much less depressing if I'd known you were actually enjoying yourself. Marcus laughed. Where's the fun in that? Besides, now you know that when humans say something is impossible, what we really mean is that we haven't figured out how to do it yet. Outside, the aurora was putting on another spectacular light show, painting the sky in colors that had no names in any language. The sparkles hummed contentedly in the warm light of the base, and for the first time in months, the crew of the Stellar Harmony felt like they were exactly where they belonged. So, Marcus said, settling back to enjoy the view, who wants to hear about my plans for upgrading the ship's life support systems? The groans that followed were exactly what he'd been hoping for. Some things, thankfully, never changed.